You will not animate the same way you do today that you will in a year from now. Welcome to this week's Animator Journey podcast episode. I hope to share with you how this evolution of your path is going to look like. So this episode is for people who are kind of starting out on their journey and they want to know what the next year, 2 years, 5 years is going to look like and how their approach is going to change, because I see a lot of students get caught up in the process and workflow and they really want to get down to the details of how something is actually made, when in reality, how you make the thing is going to change over time as your skills improve. And that should be part of your learning journey, is acknowledging that evolution of your process so that you don't get too overly focused on the process at the beginning and are more focused on the principles of animation and achieving the quality and finding your process along the way. Most students start out learning the pose-to-pose method. That method is very common, and some animators never stray away from that method. It's common because it is most akin to what 2D animators do, where they draw and flip pages and they go from key pose to key pose, and then maybe even someone else does the in-betweens, the in-betweener animator. That's how it was traditionally done, and that has carried over into 3D animation, and that's why students are typically taught the pose-to-pose method at the beginning, because it's the most tried and true and traditional method of even learning 3D animation. That's how I learned 3D animation, and that's how I recommend teaching and learning it when you're starting out, because I think it's also the best way for students to absorb the information. If we think about in 3D, the drawings are actually a 2D image. Even though we're animating in 3D, the viewer only sees the 2D image on the screen, unless you're animating something for VR, of course. That's how we should translate our thought into action for animation. So when I'm 3D animating, I look at it as a 2D drawing, and I think to myself, would I draw it the way I've posed this out? Would I animate this the way I've animated it in 3D as if I was in 2D? That's a great way to approach animation when you're starting, especially because we need to focus on the principles like posing, staging, appeal, and those are important to get down in isolated poses. So we focus on a pose-to-pose method. So we're making sure the poses work. So if you're just starting out, I would research that. And if you want my help learning it, I teach it in the beginner course at Animator's Journey. The next stage in your evolution is going to depend on a few things. Which path you go down professionally will kind of dictate what you adapt to in the future. For me, that meant I began doing some mocap work, or motion capture. The performance was captured on a stage with a real person, and that was translated onto my character, and then I had to deal with it. I had to adjust it, I had to make it work for the scene, had to edit it, delete it, reanimate it, and that process I learned how to do on the job. I was never taught how to do motion capture animation. And that's what I've done for the majority, or at least half of my career. Motion capture animation was something that I had to adapt to, and my workflow had to adapt to that kind of animation. What does that mean? That means there was a key on every frame from the moment I began animating. In pose to pose, I got to dictate, or you get to dictate, here's a single pose. I'm going to move forward 10 frames and make another pose. I'm going to move forward another 10 frames, make another pose, or whatever your method may be for pose to pose. Then you make the breakdowns. But when you start with motion capture animation, there's a key on every single frame. There's data on every single frame. And for new animators, that can be overwhelming and a lot to manage. So by going through this process of having to deal with this and feeling overwhelmed, you adapt and learn new ways to approach animation and see motion in a different way. You start to learn the graph editor a lot better. You start to get comfortable in seeing where things are counter keyed, or that if I adjust some noise here, it affects other parts of the body if they're FK, and all these kinds of more technical things come to the surface when you're having to deal with motion capture data, and your process will adjust to that. Instead, let's say you go to games or feature films. Those have their own considerations. Some games use motion capture. Feature films are usually always key framed, typically. Maybe some background characters are motion captured. That will have its own style. I mean, even within a studio, in different projects, your approach may change. Within the same project, how you approach a shot, what's happening in it, dictates the approach that you take in the process that you use. I animate now, just to jump to the end of after a decade plus of working, I use all of these methods, right? I use pose to pose, I use straight ahead, I use layered approach, I use motion capture. I use all of these approaches, and the project gets to dictate what I do. Even the shot on that project will dictate it. From shot to shot, I'll change my approach depending on what needs to happen in that shot. To accumulate all these processes takes time. That's why you can really only do one at a time. You need to figure out pose to pose, then you can move into maybe doing motion capture or doing really push cartoony stuff with pose to pose. So even the approach within pose to pose could change. You could have a slightly more straight ahead approach where you're doing breakdowns with your key poses as you animate. There's all these different kinds of nuances to each approach that's going to evolve. And acknowledging that up front is what will allow you to take a little breath and be okay with the fact that you don't have to have your process perfect. What we do want to focus on is the end result, and that will help dictate the process. So that's what I recommend. So in my journey, I went from pose to pose, then I started learning some motion capture, and then learning motion capture allowed me to start keyframe animating with a more layered approach because I could kind of see the matrix. And that matrix was seeing motion in terms of data. And that's what dealing with so much motion capture allowed me to do, is to get exposure. I needed that experience with motion capture data to feel comfortable attempting the layered approach. And that's not true for everyone. I know feature film animators who they adopted the layered approach just from keyframe animating. They didn't have to have that exposure to motion capture data. So not everything I'm saying has to be the same journey for everyone or the chronological journey that you're going to take. You could start in straight ahead and jump back to pose. It's a learning process. But in mine, I went pose to mocap, and that let me have the confidence to see motion in terms of data and only focus on one aspect at a time, meaning in a layered approach, I'm going to animate translate Z for one control for the entire animation. Then I'm going to go back to that same control at the beginning of the animation. I'm going to translate Y for the whole animation. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the animation. I'm going to animate translate X. So now I've got X, Y, Z on translation on one control animated. Now I'm going to move to the rotations of that control. Then I start on a single rotation. And that allows me freedom of movement to see the energy of a shot so that I'm not tied to single poses. And what I get at the end of doing that for an entire rig, an entire full-bodied character, is that end result is the pose. And then I can take that pose and adjust it and make it work after the fact. Instead of starting with the end pose at the beginning, like you do on pose to pose, the layered approach slowly builds that pose up. And then at the end, I can polish that pose and make that work. But I would never try to teach someone starting animation the layered approach. I would never recommend anyone to try the layered approach if you've not really captured some of the principles and foundational knowledge of animation at the beginning of your journey. The layered approach is slightly more advanced. So you need to have some really good comfort in your animation skills, which is built on a foundation typically of pose to pose. The layered approach really helped me as well when I started to animate more creatures and things became a bit more complicated with creatures and moving parts. And I found the layered approach to be good for that. But again, I sometimes use a hybrid approach. I'll start in pose to pose, then I'll switch to layered, then I'll go back to pose. So it takes time. I would never recommend a student to jump in and try to learn multiple processes all at the same time and then try to figure out which ones they should use. Learn one at a time and see how your process evolves, what you take away from learning that one process like pose to pose, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. Try to animate a bunch of different things with the same process. Don't quickly move on to another one just because you did one animation with one. You want to really get to know the ins and outs of each process and where you see opportunity to try to incorporate and improve that process. And that takes time. So when you're starting an animation, don't get overly concerned about the process because that's going to come in time. You have to get through that experience of knowing yourself, because I could tell you some of this stuff, but you have to actually go through it yourself, because you may come out with a slightly different opinion than me and you might prefer something that I don't prefer. So only you can figure this out for yourself, and you need time to go through it. Time is important. Don't get impatient with this process, because as you do, you'll get more frustrated, and that's not helpful. Try to be patient as you go through each one of these stages of your process and the evolution of that process. Also, when you're doing these kinds of approaches, Think of it in terms of distractions. I don't want to be distracted by another kind of approach while I'm in the middle of another one. So I don't want to be thinking about layered if I'm learning pose to pose. It's just good to have an awareness of these things. So don't try to start juggling 10 balls at once when you've never juggled 2 balls. So we want to slowly build up this knowledge, and that's what takes time. So that's where the patient comes in. That's where you want to be concerned about your distraction level, not allowing yourself to get distracted at a high and low level. That low level example could be if you're doing the layered approach, for example, not to get distracted by things that aren't working, because we trust the process once we have learned it. And part of learning and trusting that process is going through it and seeing it working. And that's what takes time. And you need to do multiple animations with these to prove that out. It's not always going to work the first time. You may need to try something a few times. It took me probably a year or 2 before I felt comfortable using a layered approach. In terms of production ready knowledge, it's important to know and acknowledge that clients sometimes dictate the approach you need to take. Not every client will want to see pose to pose, stepped blocking, and things popping from here and there. A client may not be able to interpret that because they're not an animator sometimes. So you need to be sensitive to what the project demands. And that's why it's good to have these multiple different kinds of approaches and comfort levels with them, so that when the project dictates it and the client dictates it because they only want to watch play blasts in spline, then we need to accommodate that and have a process that we can get to an early stage of blocking and still do it, whether it's block stepped or fully splined. That is what we need to accommodate. The other production ready consideration is how fast is each one of these processes for you. You might find one that's faster, and you may be on a project that, let's say for TV animation, doesn't really require a ton of nice fluid splined motion. It's a lot more pose to pose. And it's pose to pose because of the short timelines that you're on in TV animation that you need to get stuff done. So again, the project can dictate it, but also the speed at which you need to complete your work can also dictate the process that you choose. So to recap, we've talked about starting in pose to pose has its roots in 2D animation. I talked about in my own journey how motion capture affected my comfort level dealing with a ton of keyframes, and that led me to a layered approach because I got more comfortable with seeing motion in terms of data, and then I could just isolate that information on single transforms, like just looking at translate Y for a whole animation on one control, and that allowed me to do the layered approach. Once I got the layered approach, then I could see opportunities to take a hybrid approach, do some pose to pose, do some layered, throw in the mocap for some part of it, then adapt the mocap and throw these processes on that process. Going straight ahead in some sections because I need to get things done fast. I don't have time to kind of polish these things. And so I'm doing breakdowns in addition to my keys as I'm going, the key or golden poses. So all of this experience builds this library of knowledge that you can tap into depending on the project you're in and the kind of work you're doing. Creature animation, mocap animation, feature film animation, game animation, facial capture animation. There's so many kinds of animations. If you're going to have a long, sustainable career, you want to be able to adapt. And being able to acknowledge early in your journey that I'm going to need to adapt to different kinds of processes allows you to be open and receptive to seeing there's different ways of doing the same thing. And maybe in the future, one of these will be the best way for you to do it. But like I said, focus on one at a time when you're starting out. And I do recommend the pose to pose method for anyone starting. I think that's the best way to approach 3D animation. And that's what I teach in the beginner course. So if you're interested in learning how to do these processes, I teach the pose to pose method in the beginner course. There is a lessons only option as well as the unlimited reviews option in the full course. There's also payment plans. So if one of those interests you, go check out animatorsjourney.com and the beginner course to learn the pose to pose method. In the intermediate course, after you finish the beginner course, that's where I teach the layered approach. We also look at game animation, mocap animation, and other intermediate concepts like that in the intermediate course. Then in the advanced course, once you finish that, then we're working on demo reel shots together and we're doing more advanced animation like that. So that's how the course is structured to simplify the journey. That's why I called it Animator's Journey, beginner, intermediate, advanced. And that aligns with the processes I described: pose to pose, the mocap to layered approach and intermediate. And then in advanced, we work on advanced concepts and combine them all together. So I hope you enjoyed this week's Animator's Journey podcast episode. Be sure to listen to all the previous episodes. There's over 40 now in the library of podcast episodes. I've interviewed some great people, and I hope to see you in the next one. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff if you're watching on YouTube. And if you are watching on YouTube, check out this next video here.